This podcast is a project of the Medina Focus with the goal of providing space for collaboration and community among practitioners to the Muslim diaspora in North America. As people around the world have immigrated to the West, many Christians have realized that they live and work in the midst of the nations, and they often feel alone and unprepared to communicate cross-culturally. If you are looking for conversation and community surrounding issues of loving Muslim friends in Jesus' name, we welcome you into the conversation.
My name is Brian. Welcome to the podcast. Recently, I watched through a TED Talk video, which you can find online. It's called The Danger of a Single Story. It's by, I know I'm going to say her name incorrectly, but I'm going to go ahead and take a stab, Chimamanda Adichie. She is from Nigeria, and she shares on how we often use a single story to understand another person, a single narrative about them, a single piece of information, and that becomes our way of understanding them and everyone associated with them. And I think oftentimes when we think of immigration, migration, diaspora ministry, that many people do the same thing with practitioners in that they have a single story to understand what does Muslim ministry look like. And that story is typically based on what they've seen the most recently, whatever that story is from the news. And so they think that Muslims are, all fleeing wars, all doing some kind of, depending on which news station they listen to, all doing some kind of jihad or something. And obviously we know that is not true. In my own ministry, a lot of my focus has been on working amongst business folks, because pretty much the only reason you live in my city, Houston, is to make money. It's not for our weather or for our lovely scenery. If you've been to Houston, you know I'm being funny. It's because we have a low cost of living and good paying jobs. And so as people come to town, we certainly have a very large refugee population here, but we have a very large professional class as well. Our guest that's going to come on the show today shares quite a bit from this other side of it. She's coming from California, and she will be talking about working with business class Muslims, and it presents their own challenge. It can be very difficult in the sense that you might not be able to gain access or have a sense of belonging. Sometimes it might involve mobilizing other Christian business people who, from our side of the fence, is oftentimes the hardest group in the church to mobilize because they're very busy running successful businesses, and so they can be very difficult to get engaged in the ministry itself. And so there's just a lot of challenges that go with working with urban professionals of any group, of any class, much less in the discussion of Muslim ministry. So I hope you enjoy today's show and get to hear from her insight as well. So today we are joined by Candace, who is working in Northern California. Candace, welcome to the show.
Thanks. Happy to be here.
So Candace, just go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you're doing and where you are.
Okay, so I work in San Francisco, and I've been in San Francisco working with a couple different Muslim populations for about the past 5 years. It started out as me working with a group we call MUPPIES, which stands for Muslim Urban Professionals. It's a real word, though. You can Google it. There's articles about it. It's actually a nonprofit for MUPPIES. Anyway, and then the past couple of years, my focus has more shifted to the Yemeni community here. And then in next month, I will be moving to Chicago, actually, to spend time with the Pakistani population there while I get all my ducks in a row to hopefully move to Pakistan long-term sometime in the next year.
Okay, there's a lot there I'd love to unpack with you, starting with MUPPIES.
Yeah.
I think this is the first time I've heard that term, MUPPIES.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So I think when a lot of people get engaged in Muslim ministry in diaspora context, their primary motive for understanding internationals is the poor immigrant or the immigrant that is fleeing some kind of war zone, particularly as it relates to Middle Easterners. And so MUPPIES stood for say it again. Muslim urban
professionals. Like
professionals.
yuppies, but
Yeah.
Muslim.
Right. Okay. Um, so, what does a Muslim urban professional look like?
Yeah, so it's funny that you say all of that because I still have people who are like, "Oh, so you work with refugees?" I've never worked with a refugee in my life. Like, there's no connection with refugees.
Right.
But that's just what people assume. So yeah, Muslim urban professionals. It's funny. I've gone back and forth with David Garrison about this of whether that should be considered a real people group or not. I think it is because it's kind of just this growing population of people of like second generation or maybe 1.5 generation Muslims in the U.S. who are, really success driven and they just kind of come together from all different countries, all kinds of language and cultural backgrounds, and they come together on the basis of just being Muslim. And so, like, one of the first Muppie parties I went to was an iftar during Ramadan, and it was a potluck. And so, like, it was just ridiculous. I felt like the food on the table kind of represented the population because it was like you had like tandoori chicken, and then you had some hummus, you had some dal, and then you had like Popeye's chicken and Domino's. And that's kind
Good
of the
college
population
food.
in a nutshell. Yeah, well, and another word that's often used for them is mipsters, which maybe you've heard about. But yeah, there was actually an art exhibit, a traveling art exhibit that was here in San Francisco last year about mipster culture and the kind of like modern Muslim dress and fashion, and the way that it's really kind of changing the world of Muslims.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a real thing. It's a big thing. But it's an interesting subculture.
Yeah, and for the sake of the listeners, this is actually how Candace and I originally connected, was via the Medina Slack channel. She asked, "Is anybody else out there working with business people?" And I was very quick to chime in, me, because I had the same kind of experience where people assume, "Oh, you're working with Muslims, it's therefore you're doing refugee work," which we do have a refugee population here. I just am doing something different. We've got great people doing that work, but it's a very different mentality. So, for your Muppies, what are the kinds of jobs that they are getting into there in San Francisco?
Well, obviously it's San Francisco, so it's a lot of tech people, a lot of people working at Google, Google, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Yelp. There's several people who I've known a few people who have done their own startups, several who have like done stuff and then sold a company and are now just kind of like chilling while they come up with their next idea. One of my friends actually told me, she's like, it's a really intimidating population because there's, several of them who make things like the Forbes 30 under 30 list,
Mm-hmm.
or stuff like that. So it's a very driven, lot of lawyers, doctors, tech people, basically anything where you're gonna like make a lot of money and be really prestigious. That's what they're doing.
Yeah. Before I move on with the questions, I would like to find out a little bit more about your plans for Pakistan. I know one of the ideas that you and I have connected on over the time that I've known you is this idea that people in the diaspora are connected abroad, and I keep pushing this idea to people, and it sounds like you might be looking to make some of those connections in your work in Chicago. Is that a fair assumption on my part?
Yeah, I'm really hoping. It's actually funny because one of my good Pakistani friends here, who now lives in Austin, she has a friend in Chicago that she like wants to connect me with, and then I've talked to her about potentially connecting with her family that's in Pakistan. They might be in a city that I end up in. So yeah, the world is very interconnected, and that's what can make things like doing a podcast or something a little bit scary because
Right.
everyone can hear about stuff so easy.
Right.
but it's also a really cool thing, because you have the potential to start from a more familiar place in relationships, no matter where you are in the world,
Right.
than you would otherwise. And yeah, so I've dreamt about going to Pakistan for about 10 years now, and I have found that, like, especially with the Pakistani and even in the Indian communities here, that when I was in college, I spent about 5 months living in India, up in Kashmir, and so I've found that even just that little bit of time, and that little bit of familiarity with their culture, like, gets me in the door so much faster than somebody who's never experienced all of that.
Right.
And so I'm really hopeful that, no matter how long I stay in Pakistan, that, that will influence and help my ministry for the rest of my life, even if I end up coming back to the U.S.
Yeah. So you're not just going to Pakistan based on some connections. You're actually going to Chicago with a connection already in hand. So you said your
Yeah.
friend is living in Austin. Did you meet her in Austin? Did you meet her in San
No,
Francisco?
I met her in San Francisco.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is she a muppie? That's the question everybody wants to know.
Yeah. Yes, she is.
Okay, which explains why she's in Austin then, because it has a similar kind of job structure for young urban
Yeah.
professionals.
Well, and that's where she grew up, and she and her husband had a couple of kids, and having children in San Francisco is kind of a complicated mess. And so if you can go somewhere else where it's a little bit easier, most people do. So
Yeah, and by
that's kind of
easier,
what happened
she
with
means a lot cheaper.
her. Yeah.
So,
And she's funny. She always says she wants her life to be like mine. Like, she feels like I never work and I'm never, like, doing anything. I'm always free to hang out. And so she's like, yeah, my dream, I'm going to hire a nanny, and then I'm just going to, like, hang out with my friends all day in Austin. My life's going to be just like yours.
that's
Like,
funny.
that's fair. Yeah.
That's funny. So for the sake of the call, I know that you have many hats and many projects that you're juggling, but for the sake of the questions, I'd really like to focus on your urban professional connections and experience, just because I think that's something that you're a little bit unique in, that there's not that many people that are focused on professionals. And I think of the people that are focused on professionals, you're at kind of the deep end of the pool just based on the tech scene there in San Francisco. And so
Yeah.
I realize you're about to be shifting gears, so I'm asking these in present tense, but you can just translate it into past tense if that helps you. But what risks are you taking in your ministry there?
Yeah, I mean, it's just so weird to do, to be, like, full-time in ministry in San Francisco and not be in, like, a formal church environment or whatever. And so it feels like everything about this job is risky, because it's just, everything is me just kind of trying stuff and jumping in there and just seeing what happens. But the thing that probably comes most to mind is that, like, I'm constantly, and I know this is a topic of conversation a lot, but I'm constantly wondering if I'm doing things the right way, because I have like a very relational approach to ministry.
Right.
I'm not an aggressive evangelist. I'm not a door-to-door person. There aren't really doors to knock on in San Francisco. But, I don't do that. And I know a lot of people who have seen so many people come to faith because of just, like, just relentlessly going door to door and, like, sharing the gospel, like, really upfront, really fast. And obviously I try to get to the gospel as fast as possible with people. And I'm always very upfront about being a Christian, being somebody who works in ministry. But I'm not very aggressive about it. I'm very relational about it. And so really, to me, that honestly feels like the biggest risk, especially if I think about leaving, because I'm like, okay, I have 5 years of ministry here, and I haven't seen anyone come to faith. And there's honestly a part of me that's like, maybe I've been doing it all wrong, and if I had been doing something different, I would see different results. But as I pray about it, that's just not the sense I have, and I feel like the Lord has really assured me, like, He's been like, well, almost every Muslim you've known, you've been their first close Christian friend,
Right.
like the only one in their lives, and
Right.
And
there's value in that.
Yeah, and I've had conversations where they're like, oh, I hear Christians say stuff about Jesus all the time, but I don't really, like, what do you guys actually believe about him? Like what's the deal with him? And so, I know I've had those worthwhile conversations, but honestly, it feels risky to have, been in this for so long and seen so few, like, numbers I can record for my organization as, successes.
Yeah, I think a lot of people feel that pressure. In the previous podcast, I talked with a gentleman, and we actually go into detail about the pressure we feel to perform and to validate our strategy and our ministry choices. And there's our supporters have expectations. Our organization has expectations. Everybody wants us to kind of hold the line and do our part. And I think sometimes we forget that every context is different. And
exactly.
if our background is work overseas, there's a lot more similarity, even though I would say there's a lot of differences there as well. But in general, if you are in, pick wherever, Kumar, we'll just use a fictional place. If you're in Kumar, probably a lot of Kumaris are very similar. But in your context, I mean, you might be working with someone from one country, and then 2 seconds later be working with somebody from a completely different country, completely different point in their own country's salvation history.
Exactly.
And I think it's just hard to live in both worlds where there is this strong expectation that we perform. On the other hand, to realize, like you said, that you are the first, or in some cases, maybe the only Christian that these people know. And I would encourage you and say a seed well planted is better than just randomly planting everywhere. And I realize there's multiple models. I'm not saying anything bad about the other model, but I think sometimes we focus on something because it puts some numbers on the board without realizing there's a deeper process with a much harder group. But man, if those people believe, I mean, look at what they're bringing to the kingdom, and look at who they're connected to.
Yeah,
so,
for real.
I'm encouraged by what you're doing.
Yeah, I've felt myself really drawn lately to. I had never noticed this verse until a couple months ago, but I've used the story of the Samaritan woman to kind of talk about my approach to ministry a lot. And at the end of that story, Jesus tells the disciples that they're reaping things that they didn't sow as they're seeing the faith of the Samaritans. I've just really been drawn to that, like, and just that prayer that there will be others who come along later who reap the work that I've done here.
That's right.
And just
that's right.
Being aware of the reality of that.
You and I have had conversations offline about this, about relational methodology, and I went through the same kind of fear. When I lived in the Middle East, I was in one of the countries that the Arab Spring was raging quite strong in, and we actually had to leave for a little bit. And there were some of my friends that, I mean, part of it was my Arabic skills weren't ready yet, and so I'd had some good conversations with them, and they knew that I wanted to share my faith, but I hadn't yet shared it. And I had to just trust, okay, God is sovereign. He set these people up in my life, and sure enough, within 2 months, I was back in the country and able to share with them, and they still didn't believe. They still didn't believe. That's the kicker to the story. But it does show that God's sovereignty really needs to be a central part of how we see things, particularly for diaspora context, because people come in and out. I mean, you already mentioned your friend has moved to Austin, and yet she's not out of your story. She's actually hopefully helping you get connected there in Chicago. How awesome would that be? So
yeah, exactly.
So I think a lot of times we're in our various ministry lanes, and you might sign up with an organization that does a particular project, and there's a lot of non-tangibles or unintended outcomes to ministry. What are some of the unintended outcomes that you've seen in where you're working?
Yeah. I mean, the first thing I think of with this is just the number of failed projects. I've tried so many things, and I'm coming to grips with just, I really am more of an ideas person than like an execution person. So often I have big ideas and I'm really bad at bringing them to fruition. One of the reasons we really need teams around us. But I think one of the things that really comes to mind with this is my relationship with a local mosque. So there's this mosque that was where I started doing all of this, because I, when I first started trying to get into the Muslim community here, I just really felt like an invitation from God that was like, well, you like Muslims, like go find some. Because I was just in a really like aimless spot in life. I had just finished seminary and wasn't sure what to do with myself. And so I, as most women who finish seminary are, they're not doing children's ministry. So too far, I don't know. So anyway, I started going to this mosque for just Friday services and trying to meet people. And after a while, I did that for probably like close to 2 years. But by the end of that, it just started to feel like I was dragging myself there. And it was like, I would sit in the back and pray and try to meet people, but it just felt like I saw the same people every week. And it was like, they knew what my deal was. I knew what their deal was. And we just weren't going to be friends. And so I kind of started to take a step back from that. And I was like, well, like, who am I if I'm not going to the mosque every Friday? Like, that's it's like my trademark move, And then I'm not really sure when it happened, but basically I started to think like, okay, well, maybe like this mosque has kind of been a place for me that has felt, fruitful and open. And so I started trying to organize like kind of groups to go for a visit there to just like learn about Muslims in San Francisco. And eventually I got like pretty well connected with the imam who heads up the mosque, and ended up with his phone number, which I still think is funny. And so in my very basic Arabic, I could like text him salam, and he's like, "You're the smartest person in the world," which is great.
You have to hang on to that as you go into language learning.
Right, yeah. It's like, yeah, the Arabs have been so encouraging in any little bit of Arabic I can do, especially when they find out I can read it. They're like, wow, that's the best. So anyway, I just started kind of setting things up with him, and last year I got to take a group I just reached out to him and was like, hey, like, is there any way we can serve the mosque? And he was like, well, we could really use the basement being cleaned before Ramadan, because that's where we feed everyone for iftar. And so there happened to be a short-term team in my vicinity, and they were open to going and doing that. And so we went and we cleaned the mosque and just got to like pray over the basement and, the iftars that were going to happen there. And then I took several groups for iftar during Ramadan. And when I took the group from my church, this imam, he came over into the women's section where I'm chilling with everyone, and he's like, where's, I'm like, I'm right here. He's like, everyone is a friend to the Islamic Society. I just kind of laughed because all my church people were sitting there looking at me like, who is this old man, and like, why does he like you so much? And it's just, I don't know, I just laugh about it because I'm not sure, like, did I set out to be a friend to the Islamic Society in San Francisco? Like, probably not. And like, maybe some people think like, oh, well, you haven't, if you were more upfront about the gospel, then like, they would be upset with you, and we should be in that place. But I don't know. It feels fun to be loved and wanted at a local mosque, and so anyway, that's kind of just been a project that I've seen kind of shift and change, but has always been a part of my work here.
Probably any work in San Francisco is challenging, regardless of who you're working with. And then, you're working with a very professional group, and then these professionals are Muslims and from all over the world. So this is almost sounds like a dumb question, but what are the greatest challenges to your ministry?
Yeah, I mean, I could make a really long list. One of those is definitely the culture of San Francisco. That people are very, very busy here, and I mean, I think they say that in every big city, but here it really is like super, super normal to work about 60 hours a week and to just constantly be online and at work. And so setting things up with people is hard, especially, setting things up with young professionals. I had people flake on me so many times in that. And the other part of that is that the average stay here is about 1 to 3 years. And so it's, there's some conversations about like working with international students and how it's like you don't have long enough to really like get super deep with people. And it's kind of the same issue here in San Francisco. And then kind of a side problem that's funny is like the dating scene here is just horrible. And it's horrible for Muslims and Christians alike. It's actually something that we relate really well over together. And we actually have opposite problems. There are like too many Muslim men and too many Christian women. So I keep telling the men if they would just convert, they'd have all kinds of options available for them. But basically, like what one of my friends says, because sometimes I would just have these friends who just kind of disappear. They start kind of just flake away. And one of my friends was like, yeah, I've seen that a lot here. I think like these girls, they just, once they reach like 25, they have to find a husband, like it's time. And when they're professionals here, that just becomes the only thing they do with their free time is looking for a husband. So you become really on the back burner. And I was like, oh, well, like in a weird way, that makes me feel better. But a little sad.
So in a lot of South Asian cultures, they have this job title, which is called matchmaker. And there's actually, it's a paid position. I have a couple of Indian friends that I'm trying to hook up for the, thousands of rupees that are involved in the transaction. That's not a lot of money, just for the record.
No, yeah.
But maybe this, maybe you've hit on a strategy where you could be a matchmaker as a way, if that's their only point of contact with you, or when they're kind of hiding away from you because they're trying to find a mate, maybe that would make you more intriguing to them. If you could,
that'd be hilarious. Yeah.
Yeah, I know this sounds like a spoof that we're creating, but that might not actually be a terrible idea.
No, I totally think it could really work. Yeah.
So,
well, in a few years.
Yeah, there we go. So there's, in this call, we've already highlighted one of the divisions in Christian work, which is between people that kind of want to get to the gospel like right on the first conversation, the first few minutes, and others who realize the importance of relationships and building trust. But that's just one of many, this or that type conflicts. And so how do you navigate these disagreements in your local context?
Yeah, so a part of my difficulty in San Francisco is I've never really had a good team here. So I haven't necessarily run into this as much as I might have in a different place, but really just one of my kind of personal mottos, if you will, is just to honor God's good work in the lives of others. And so I think a big thing about it is just assuming that everyone and the way that they're doing ministry under the authority of God. And, I have to trust and believe that, especially with the challenges we were facing in like doing diaspora ministry and working in cities, that there is not just one approach that is right. There's probably thousands of approaches that God has ordained to just get the work done. And so I just find that it's really important when I'm finding myself really disagreeing with somebody or wondering if that's right, to kind of go back to no, I need to honor that God is working in that person's life, just like they're working in mine. And just trust that that's going to work out okay. And that there are people that I'm going to offend and I'm going to be a terrible witness to. And there are people that, others are going to offend and be a terrible witness to. And hopefully somewhere along the line, we all manage to share Jesus in an understandable way.
You have a policy of mutual and shared disappointment amongst all of us. I like that.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Mutually assured disappointment. No one model will rule them all. I like that. It could be the title for your book, Mutually Shared Disappointment.
Yeah. That would be a great title. I like
that. That's kind of like that lady, Jamie, the Very Worst Missionary. I don't know if you've ever seen any of her stuff,
yeah.
but it's just very self-deprecating, and it kind of creates a very flat. It makes it easy to identify as a listener. You don't feel like you're not a super Christian like she is.
Yeah.
So navigating identity is one of the big problems, and I just imagine for you this is even harder because I think in many contexts people make the assumption that, well, they're so new here, they don't get that I'm working with an organization or something. And I would actually challenge that I think people are smarter than we give them credit for. But I think certainly in your context, where people are actually working for Google and for probably every app that's on your phone, in theory could either access information or in some way, they're just a smarter group of people that are going to see through any kind of angle. So how do you navigate your identity of being a Christian worker and your relational approach and all of those things? How do you put that together?
Yeah, so it's been a journey of, kind of trying different things on for size. And I have a really close relationship with my church here, so that helps. So my very short answer when people ask what I do is just I work for a church. I work for the church, But a few years ago, I think I was just feeling really exhausted by if I was in a small group with my church, I'll refer to myself as a missionary. But if I'm, in a context where I don't know, the salvation status of people, I'll refer to myself as a Bible teacher or a bridge builder or something. And, if I'm with Muslims, I would talk about it kind of from a different angle. And it just started to feel really exhausting, just the constant code switching. And so last year I finished training as a spiritual director. And I've found that it doesn't really work with the Yemenis. I stick with the other stuff with them, but with the MUPPIES and with any average San Franciscan and even any average churchgoer, I find that I can talk about being a spiritual director, and I can use the language that comes with spiritual direction, which is all very open and invitational.
Right.
And I find that really works with any group that I'm with, and that's been really freeing for me. Because I can just talk about how, my goal is to, see how God is working in people's lives and to help them hear from him and be close to him, which is what I do. So I find that usually just the more I can just describe what being a missionary means to me, the more people think that I do a great thing instead of all the negative associations that often come with the word missionary.
Yeah, for sure. So share one tip for a healthy work-life balance.
Yeah. really the thing that comes most to mind is just, be single and stay single. So honestly, I think a lot about how I have full reign over my time. I have a lot of friends who are married with kids, and their time is just, they don't get to choose what they do when they wake up in the morning.
Very, very true.
But I really, really do. And so, like, I'll have days where I wake up, and from the moment I wake up, I feel like God is like, you need to take today to rest. Like, this is your Sabbath day.
Mm-hmm.
Do it. And I'm usually like pretty stubborn about it because I like to feel productive. And I'm going to like do some emails and stuff. And I just feel him kind of like poking me all day. Like, no, like this isn't what we talked about. Like, but yeah, I mean, as silly of a life hack as that might sound like, I guess just to encourage anyone who might be listening who's single, that like, it really is a huge gift.
Mm-hmm.
To it, it really frees me up to be obedient in ways that people who have, just other lifestyles don't.
Yeah, that's true.
So, yeah,
and
Paul
has a lot to say about that regarding ministry that we often pass over.
Yeah.
I think in many ministry spheres, singleness is seen as like an unfortunate byproduct or symptom that we need to help you overcome and fix. And I think we're forgetting Paul's instructions that if you're single and can be single, that use your singleness for the Lord. So I think that's it's actually a good word. It's not practical for those of us who that ship has sailed for.
Don't have that option.
Yeah, that's very true. That's very true. So we love stories on the show. Candace, tell us a story.
Yeah, so I love to tell the story of my my friend that I met at the mosque, who's now in Austin. But she was just fun because I met her after I had been going through the Friday services for a few months, and I met her because I had, I went so regularly that I knew who was there, and yeah, just what was going on with them. And so when I saw her, I went up to her after the service and was like, hey, I haven't seen you here before. Like, what's your story? And she was, said her name, and then she's like, oh, I did my Hajj just a couple months ago, and so I'm trying to get back into coming to Jumma. And so I was like, oh, that's cool. Like, do you want to go get coffee sometime? And so, yeah, we started just like meeting for coffee weekly for a while. And the second time we got coffee, she's like, so I have you figured out. And I was like, excuse me?
Oh boy.
It's like, yeah, I have you figured out because like this is a weird random side thing, but the week before we had been talking about Myers-Briggs personality types, and I had guessed hers like spot on because she's an ESTJ, which are like pretty easy to guess because they're just a certain type of person. And so she thought that was weird that I was able to guess that. And so she's like, I have you figured out, you're with the FBI, aren't you? And I was like,
wow.
She's like, because like you guessed my Myers-Briggs, that's weird that you know that. And then like I'm Pakistani and I'm married to an Iranian man, and so like there's a lot of information you could get from us. And and this is a muppie, she's like, she grew up in the U.S. She's not anyway. And well, my first response to her was, well, I'm too fat to be in the FBI. Because years ago, I had heard a story about two guys who were missionaries in like Chad, and they had been taken by the secret police and were accused of being in the CIA. And one of the guys was tall and skinny, and one was short and fat. And they were like, well, we know you're tall, skinny friends in the CIA, but like you're too fat to be in the CIA, so we're not sure what your deal is.
Oh wow!
And so that was the first thing that came to my mind. Which she was like, no, that doesn't matter, And I was like, sure, like I'd never make it through boot camp. Come on. But then we just kept talking about it, and I was like, yeah, I just, like, she was like, but if they asked you, would you? It's like, no, like, it's not worth it to me. And anyway, so it's this ongoing running joke, even to the point that she was texting me about this friend in Chicago recently. And she was like, my mom and dad think this girl's in the FBI, but she's really nice, so you should connect with her in Chicago. So anyway, it's just been this long-running joke between the two of us. So, yeah, my friendship with her has just been really sweet and fun and kind of hilarious because, we would be at, like, MUPPIE parties together, and, like, she's gorgeous. She's this beautiful Pakistani woman, like, just has, like, beautiful, voluptuous hair that I fantasize about, and, like, she's, like, very, like, wealthy and, like, just polished, and, she worked for a hedge fund. Like, she's just this very polished person, and, like, I am not, and so, like, people would kind of see us together at these parties, and they'd be like, so, like, basically, like, why are you guys friends? Like, you don't make any sense together. And my friend, she'd be like, well, like, white girl here, she welcomed me to the mosque one of my first times back, and none of you people did that. So, like, we're friends now. We're friends.
Wow.
And, it was just a funny thing. And so, yeah, I mean, she and we had so many good conversations over the years of just, like, about like Christian community a lot, because I think she really struggles with Muslim community. Tends to be, it's hard to, like, trust people, and you're, like, not open about things. You hide everything,
Right.
Whereas, like, the second time I hung out with her, I was like, yeah, I'm in therapy because I'm a mess and I don't know what I'm doing. And she's like, why do you feel like you can just share these things with me? Like, aren't you ashamed of that? And I was like, no, like, I mean, we're all of us, like, so we might as well talk about it.
Yeah.
And I think that I'm just unlike anybody else she's ever been friends with. And yeah, so I've just gotten to talk about kind of the gospel from that angle so many times of, like, I can be open about my messiness and my sin because it's not the thing that controls me, and it's not the thing that defines me. Like, I'm defined by Christ. And there have been so many times where she's been like, man, that sounds so nice. Like, that sounds like so many of the things I want. And I'm always like, well, you're welcome to come over to our side anytime you want to. But, she hasn't made that decision yet. But
yeah,
now her daughter actually in Austin is at a preschool at a church. And she sent me a video recently of her daughter pointing to this little, like, cartoon cutout that's supposed to be Jesus. And she's like, oh, who is that? And her daughter's like, it's Isa. And my friend's like, oh, who's Isa? And she's like, Isa's my friend, So it's just like, I've been praying over her child since before she was born. And so,
that's good.
I like to hope that there's potential fruit there, but just waiting.
I think there's one element of your story that highlights perfectly the challenge of working with business professionals versus other groups. And I realize for those who are doing refugee work, just in terms of man hours and sometimes sheer physical labor, you've definitely got us beat. But that's also a pretty easy doorway in. There was a lady who came or wanted to come from Chicago to Houston, where I live, and to work with Pakistanis. And in her context, I think she was working with refugees, and she said, well, we're going to set up a clothes closet and a food pantry. And yes, and I go, ma'am, let me stop you right there. I said, I would love to have you here. We don't have a single, to my knowledge, Urdu work going, but our Pakistanis all have, advanced degrees, drive Mercedes, live in 3,000 to 4,000 square foot homes with pools. Like, one of them is richer than, like, our entire team put together, and so there's no that line you said of, like, why are the two of you together? That's exactly what people think when they think of us, because none of us come from money or have that kind of success or all the other fixings, the trappings that go with that lifestyle. And so that is one of the
Yeah.
challenges: is how do we connect and how do we find them?
Yeah, it's one of the hardest things is just kind of getting access and getting connection and belonging in that group, you know. I got my ears pierced so that I could look fancier. Because I was like, I need to wear more jewelry. Like, what's cheap? Like, earrings.
Right.
So, you know, it's the little things we do.
Well, we expect to see your earring game get big when you go over to Pakistan, because you can get stuff there. So
It's going to be fun, yeah.
what do you think other practitioners should know that you've discovered?
So two like little things on the side are that like just the power of vulnerability. I've seen that over and over again, whether I'm sharing with my Muslim friends or whether I'm sharing with Christians who support me, that like people aren't used to really like intense openness, and it usually brings down all their defenses. And I've just seen that over and over again. And then along with that is kind of one of the harder things of doing ministry sometimes is doing support raising. And, you know, sometimes it's easy to get into a place of thinking like, oh, I don't want to really be honest about my struggles or whatever with people who are supporting me because I want them to think that I'm like strong and capable. But I've just seen such wonderful support, like, you know, in non-financial ways come from the people who financially support me because I have been honest about things that have been hard for me. And I've found that support raising has just kind of like built in this huge community of people who, you know, really love me and care for me and are invested in my life. And it's been just one of the like biggest surprise blessings to me in this line of work. But then the other thing that I really wanted to share was that, you know, I've talked a little bit about spiritual direction, but about 3.5 years ago, I started meeting with a spiritual director because I had to do that as a requirement to become a spiritual director. And, at first I did it just out of a class requirement. But then I've found that it's been one of the most useful things in my ministry life. Because like basically, and I'm working on an article on this, but basically it's like you get someone who, you know, spiritual directors are supposed to be completely disconnected from your life. You're not supposed to know them kind of in your normal context. And so it's just really rare when you're in ministry to be able to talk to a Christian who, you know, is not investing in your work. You know, you're not trying to convince of anything. And someone who, you know, spiritual director is basically just a professional listener. And so just like sitting with my spiritual director, you know, just once a month for an hour, I feel like made such a huge difference in my ministry, because it was just like someone I could talk to who's totally objective, who is really just trying to listen for how God is working in my life. And is not trying to get me to be more productive, isn't giving me problems to solve, you know, isn't giving me a task list. It's just, you know, listening with openness. And that's just been just so, so valuable. And it's way cheaper than therapy. So.
Well, that's a strong recommendation then. So if God would answer one prayer with a yes, what would you ask?
Yeah. Honestly, I think the biggest one would be, you know, I've read stories about mosques in other places, you know, where the leaders become Christians and then all of, you know, the congregation kind of follows in a strong way. And that's just been my prayer over this local mosque that I've had a relationship with for 5 years now. Like, it's a super, super diverse mosque. It's like they set up their Friday services so that people can make it there during their lunch break and make it back. So it's like from like 1:15 to 1:45. And, you know, it's just there's people from literally all around the world. Some people don't speak English, but other people, work for Google that show up there. And every time I'm there, I'm just kind of struck with this vision of, that throne room scene in Revelation of all the peoples gathered before the throne, that like if a place like that mosque could become a center of worshiping Christ, then it would literally change the world. There's so many connections and just so much power and potential there. But I think, that would be my big one to ask for.
Yeah, that's a good prayer. Well, Candace, I'm going to be trying to keep up with you over the coming months and years, and I'll be praying for you as you go.
Of luck.
And I'm really excited to hear how these connections from San Francisco to Austin to Chicago work, and then from you going from San Francisco to Chicago to Pakistan work. And so hopefully we'll have some updates to these at some point in the future. So thank you very much for coming on the show.
Yeah, you're welcome. Really glad to do it.
You've been listening to the Medina Podcast. This show is hosted by Brian Hebert and produced by Nate Schultz. The conversations we have on this program are born out of an expanding environment of collaboration among grassroots ministry practitioners across the North American continent. Click subscribe in your favorite podcast app and take a moment to help us get the word out to others by sharing this program freely. If you would like to engage on a deeper level, please email us at medinafocus@vision59.com.